Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind Headlines. And in this programme tonight, we shall be discussing the release of 4 young Israeli women from the captivity of Hamas in the latest ceasefire agreement that Israel has with Hamas. We'll be asking what is the condition and the long-term effects that their brutal captivity will have upon them, but also what impact will this have on Israel's war strategy to destroy Hamas and ensure they don't have a presence? And does President Trump's idea of removing over 1 million residents in Gaza and transfer them to Egypt or Jordan have any bearings on the Middle East today? Regan, it's great news that these 4 young Israeli girls, they were conscripts in the Israeli army, only between 19 and 20 were actually released on Saturday, as the whole of the world's media was drawn to Palestine Square in Gaza, where they were paraded up on stage before they were then given over to the Red Cross, and then they came home jubilantly to their families. It's great news, isn't it, that these young girls, after 477 days in captivity, held also 15 months as well, are finally home with their families and their loved ones.
Yeah, it truly is. I was watching live as it was unfolding, and you know, there was definitely a sense they have struggled. They're coached through all of the PR of Hamas. You know, they have to have the smiles and everything, but you can see through the tincture of the skin that they have barely seen sunlight, and those are the reports that are being given. They also have been presented as pretty malnourished. This has been true across the board with hostages, although prior to release, Hamas is doing a sort of a rehabilitation, a fast-track rehabilitation to try to present them in good health, to give that illusion. The Jerusalem Post has recently been reporting on that. But at the end of the day, overjoyed that they are with their families, that they are back home safe with their loved ones. There's a big journey to go forward for them. They have up to this point not separated. They were together, they were taken together. You and I saw the video footage of when they were taken from their particular outpost, their military outpost. They stayed together, they were kept together the whole time, and in fact there is still one who remains in Gaza but is due to be released this next week, who was with them that whole time. And they have, upon arriving back, meeting family, meeting friends, they've done everything together. So there's a lot that's going to be worked through psychologically. There's a lot that's going to need to transpire to help them assimilate back into the norm of the day-to-day.
Yep, so just a reminder of the overview of discussion for tonight's programme. So last Saturday, which was the 25th of January, we saw 4 young Israeli women released who were conscripts in the Israeli army. They are Karina Ariev, Daniella Gilboa, Naama, Levy and Liri Albag were released by Hamas on the 25th of January and paraded by Hamas on stage in Palestine Square in Gaza as part of Hamas's PR campaign. And Liri Albag, 19, only began her military service at the Nahal Oz army base 3 days before she was violently kidnapped by Hamas back on October the 7th, 2023.
It is wonderful to see the hostages come home, but in return we have to remember that Israel has paid a high price, and this is going against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's stated war objectives in Gaza, one of which is the total eradication of Hamas in Gaza. Personally, I don't even think that's possible ideologically. That the ideology has continued to expand. You're dealing with a whole population of people who are supporting Hamas in mass. The second was preventing them from having power again to carry a future, October the 7th. This seems to have been sacrificed due to pressure from the new Trump administration by releasing over 1,900 Palestinian prisoners with Israeli blood on their hands. And this is not an exaggeration or a false statement. These are murderers, these are rapists, these are murderer rapists, these are terrorists, would-be terrorists. You can find detail on each and every prisoner who has been released. Some will say, oh, what about the children? Yeah, what about the children? Some of those children are also murderers and rapists as well. And you know, the reality is across Gaza, across even the regions under control of the Palestinian Authority, you have from a very young age, we talked about it before the 7th of October, just months before, the terror training camps that these children are going through. But it's been seen as the only way to bring them home. And it's the price that has been considered worth paying. President Trump's bold plan of removing over 1 million people from Gaza into neighboring Egypt and Jordan. Some are discussing now, is this a possible solution? Egypt isn't keen, Jordan isn't keen, but will there be a kind of a bargaining routine that goes on here to see some of that take place? We're asking in this program, can a post-Gaza have a future? Post-war Gaza, can it have a future despite the misery and pain inflicted upon it after Hamas's evil and vile actions against southern Israel back on October 7th?
No, absolutely. But with this program, I think it's also important that we echo what the Word of God says, and in particular Psalm 121, which is entitled, God, the help of those who seek him. And of course all of you will know this one very well. I will lift up my eyes to the hills, from whence comes my help. My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. He will not allow your foot to be moved. He who keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord shall preserve you from all evil. He shall preserve your soul. The Lord shall preserve your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore.
It is a beautiful reminder, Simon, that the Lord is the one who keeps us and who protects and who will continue to lead and guide his people even through the most catastrophic of circumstances. 4 of these women released this past Saturday. Certainly we can pray that they would have a tangible sense of knowing the Lord has been their keeper.
Absolutely, and of course the remaining hostages as well, because I think now finally I think the Israeli government know who's alive and who's dead regarding the hostages. So those who are still alive, we just pray that God's presence would be with them and they would sense his love, his joy and his peace being in the midst of the most horrific situation that they're facing, being held captivity against their will for over 15 months by Hamas. Now, the Times of Israel reported under the following headline: unfazed, freed hostages say they knew they had to project strength at Hamas's handover. On the morning of Saturday, the 25th of January, we saw jubilant scenes of 4 young Israeli IDF women reunited with their loved ones after being held captive by Hamas for 15 months and 477 days.
They told family and friends about periods with no food, cleaning toilets for terrorists, months without showers, seeing TV news of protests on their behalf as well. We showed them on the stage that we were not fazed. TV News quoted one of them as telling family and friends, "It had no impact on us. We are stronger than them." They definitely did project that strength as they were released on Saturday. They told their family and friends that they determinedly showed Hamas during the staged event the terror group had arranged for their handover that they would not be humiliated, according to reports of their initial conversations. And you know, there's these propagandists who are out there, weird deniers of what's happened, who say, oh look, they look happy, oh they're smiling, they look well treated. They actually don't. Anyone who can see even some of the footage of individuals, how they are walking, how they are the skin complexion, all of these things, you can tell that they are not physically or mentally and emotionally fully well. They have suffered immensely and intensely at this time in every way. Some are even reporting sexual abuse, routine sexual abuse at the hand of their captors. I'm sure we will tragically be hearing more such stories of that. But here they realize we are not going to go out with trembling knees. We're going to stand strong, we're going to smile, we're going to flash the victory sign, not for Gaza, but for us, because we survived.
And they showed and projected incredible strength.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Which was amazing. So
they came through together. And
the Times of Israel also report that the 4 young women were abducted. They were part of the IDF's surveillance soldiers. Karina Ariev, 20, Daniella Gilboa, also 20, Naama, Levy, 20, and Liri, Albag, 19, walked up on the stage in the square in Gaza City calmly and confidently, and smiled and waved to the crowds of Hamas terrorists and Gazans. The 4 had been were put in quasi-military uniforms to wear and were required to walk across the square and to stand on stage with armed Hamas operatives by their sides. The 4 who were taken hostage by Hamas-led terrorists at their base in Kibbutz and Nahal Oz back on the 7th of October 2023, have also told family and friends that they were held together with a 5th surveillance soldier you mentioned, Agam Berger, until a few days before their release, and that it was very hard for them when they realized that Berger was not going to be freed with them. 15 surveillance soldiers were killed at the base during the Gaza terrorist onslaught, and having seen the Hamas video of when they murdered those young girls was absolutely horrific, and for Hamas to put them in uniform when they were kidnapped in their pajamas and their night gear, pretending that these are prisoners of war, was nothing less than disgusting.
It really was. Can TV reported the released hostages saying that Liri Albag was the leader of their group and spoke to the terrorists on their behalf, with Naama Levy, a triathlete held for some time with Doron Steinbecker, who was released on Sunday, and they exercised together for body and soul. Some of them learned Arabic while they were held hostage, and Khan reported that when they were in an IDF helicopter after their release and were told to sit down, they joked that they didn't understand and the soldiers should speak to them in Arabic, maintaining a good sense of humor
absolutely.
there as well. One of the 4 was held in a tunnel alone for a long time in the dark in conditions in which it was hard to breathe. They were moved around Gaza during their 477 days in captivity, including in Gaza City, they've said, some of them meeting very senior Hamas people. There were periods when there was no food. According to Channel 12 in Israel, reporting them saying that there were times when they had to cook for terrorists, clean toilets for them, but were denied food themselves. Other reports I saw, Simon, were speaking of how essentially their diet was a little bit of bread and a little bit of rice. There was no active nutrition ingredient involved, which is a really horrendous state. But the IDF operating nearby, of course, throughout this, it was definitely scary, they said, because you know, there's active operations, and the IDF did not know where they were. So they helped and supported each other through those times.
And the Times of Israel also reports that they heard the radio a lot in captivity, and they're aware of the families and other Israeli struggles on their behalf. Even one of them said they actually heard one of their family members wish one of them a happy birthday. They also saw some TV, including coverage of the protests on their behalf, and have said that this gave them strength. They even joked among themselves about the pictures their families had chosen of them to use on posters urging their release, the TV report said. Some of them were held in homes in Gaza, many of them civilian homes. Israel's Channel 12 reported some of them played with children of their captors. Some of them said that their captors treated them shockingly, and that they did not get proper medical treatment, including or sustained injuries when they're being abducted. More than one of them went for long periods without being able to shower, without sanitary conditions, and some of them were not even allowed to hold hands or to cry. Now, for this week's Behind Headlines, we have a special guest joining us from North London. Her name is Levy Feldman, and she's the director of the UK Family Hostage Forum. Levy, warm welcome to Behind Headlines.
Hi, Simon. Hi, Regan. Thank you for having me.
And Levy, can you just share with us where you were on that horrific day known as October the 7th back in 2023, and how you got involved in really doing amazing work in helping the hostages get released, as we're seeing the fruits of that now?
So 7th of October, I was in Bournemouth in my house. I woke up very early in the morning, looked at my phone and saw that my friends are writing in one of our groups that there is a big intrusion going into Israel and there's an attack, that a whole army base is being slaughtered, that the checkpoint has been taken over by terrorists, and that there's a festival that's being slaughtered. And it just was moments of shock. And they were going into Telegram and getting all these horrific footage. It was a really, really hard day. It was a day that I didn't know whether my friends and my family, are they safe? Are they not safe? It was a really, really hard day.
Levy, would you walk us through a little bit of the days that followed and how this began to lead you to get involved in the campaign to release the hostages?
So the next few days were, a whirlwind of, I remember that day hearing a girl, 23-year-old, calling the TV in Israel, begging for help, saying she can see her dad paraded without clothes in Gaza, in his underwear. If I'm not mistaken, it was the daughter of Waad Ben Ami, who's still held hostage. And, it just was shock. And then one day, about a week after 7th of October, there was a choir of Israeli children, all dressed in white, singing Stand By Me. And as I sat and heard their beautiful voices singing, my 8-year-old then, who's very musical, heard it and came to sit next to me. And I didn't think there's anything sinister in what I'm seeing. And he sat next to me and we watched the video. And then they started showing pictures of all the children that were kidnapped. And suddenly my 8-year-old says, "Mom, why is the boy from summer camp on TV?" And it was a moment that I think my heart broke. And I understood how evil the attack is, how it could have been my kids, my family, anyone in Israel this attack would have been against. And my kids, 6 weeks before that, in August, I took my kids to learn Hebrew. So they went to summer camps in central of Israel, in Kfar Saba. They were with Ohad Munder Zichri in a multi-sport summer camp. And then 6 weeks later, he was abducted from his grandparents' house in Nir Oz. And when I learned that he was abducted, I started campaigning. I never went to a demonstration in my life before. I was never very political. And next day they had, I don't know if you remember, the empty buggy installation underneath the Big Ben. I had back then a 5-month-old baby, and I told my husband, I can't stay at home. I'm taking the baby, I'm taking his buggy, I'm taking his sling, and I'm going. And we went and we put his buggy underneath with all the other 50 buggies to represent all the kids that were abducted. And I started telling the story of Ohad, that it was just a lovely boy playing with my kids and taken from his grandparents' home with his mother, with his grandpa, with his grandma. And that's how it all began.
Levy, your story there is absolutely heartbreaking. About a year ago, Regan and myself actually visited Nir Oz. We saw the total destruction of that beautiful kibbutz by Hamas back on October the 7th, and the sheer magnitude and the scale of that mass terrorist attack by Hamas is something that's going to live with us for the rest of our lives. But share with us how the campaign on behalf of the Family Hostage Forum has really gathered momentum, not only in London but throughout the world, to bring the hostages home. And now it seems to have united not only Israel but the entire Jewish community and supporters, Christian supporters of Israel around the world, to unite behind one single cause, and that's to bring those precious hostages home to their families and their loved ones.
So in England, I can give you the example in England that, you know, the events, they started from the very next day after the 7th of October, 8th of October. People felt the need to call out to the world and saying, you know, our loved ones have been kidnapped. And they started hanging posters of the hostages around London. And that effort grew bigger and bigger. And in April, in the Bournemouth vigil, we started a campaign of tie a yellow ribbon for the hostages. And I can't believe that it's been, you know, 9 months already of tying yellow ribbons, and this campaign grew bigger and bigger. And in June, there was a march, very big, across many cities. I think 20 or 30 cities took part of it, and it was called United, We Bring Them Home. And we organized this march across a few organizations here, and over 40,000 people came to march and asked to bring the hostages home. And it was an incredible day. We marched from Holborn all the way down to Downing Street. But I saw that, you know, it was an incredible day. So many people came out, and the media didn't care. It didn't make a dent. And I realized that if we want to change in England people's perspectives, we need to go beyond the Jewish bubble. So the next thing I did, I approached Conservative Friends of Israel and Labour Friends of Israel and Lib Dem Friends of Israel. It was around July time. And I said, you know, I know in September and October you're going to have party conferences before the parliament reconvenes. Can we please bring hostage families to meet as many of your MPs? So over 2.5 weeks, we've arranged over 100 face-to-face, very small meetings between MPs and hostage families. And again, over 300 MPs got to hear them in bigger formats. So I think that was the beginning of starting to campaign in a bigger way here in England. And we've launched Adopt a Hostage. So we're calling MPs to adopt a hostage, meet one family of a hostage online, know their story, what really hurts them, worries them, and try and be their voice in Parliament and beyond Israel.
Levy, tell us a little bit about the emotions within the Family Hostage Forum following the news that there's a plan in place that will see many of these hostages brought home. What are the emotions at the moment?
So it's every time a hostage come out of Gaza, it's a big, big relief. And we're, you know, thankful to God that they're coming out and their families can start rehabilitating. But it opens a very big wound for every hostage that doesn't come out. So we know with this stage, we were supposed to see all the children and women civilian come out, and then it was supposed to be the soldier women, and then the elderly men, and then the sick and, you know, sick young men. But we had 3 civilians came out, and in the next week we were supposed to see all the rest of the children and civilians, and they brought us 4 women soldiers. And now it's a big question, what's going on with Arbel Yahud? What's going on with Shiri Bibas? What's going on with her 2-year-old Kfir Bibas and with her 5-year-old Ariel Bibas? Where are they? And it's, you know, it's massive concern to their to their chances to come back home alive. So it's very mixed emotions. I know yesterday Israel received a list from Hamas of who's alive and who's dead. And families were told that, you know, 8 families were told that it's probable, or it's getting more and more likely, that their loved ones are not coming back alive from Gaza. And it feels like 7th of October again. I've sat with many of these families one-to-one and heard the stories again and again with each meeting of how their loved ones were taken and what the family has been doing since. And I'm really, my heart is with them. And I feel like until we have clarity, many people of the Jewish people and the Israeli people, we can't breathe at the moment. We're waiting with them.
I can imagine, Nivi. But share with us, Nivi, the high price that Israel has to pay for the release of these hostages, to release 1,900 Palestinian prisoners that have Israeli blood on their hands, that are terrorists. And I know this has opened up deep wounds in Israel. And of course, the priority of the Israeli government and the priority of the Israelis is to bring the hostages home. But share a little bit about the high cost that Israel has to pay in order to bring these hostages home, which is horrific, because outside Israel, I don't think any Western nation can really comprehend what Israel and the Israeli people, including the families of the hostages, are actually going through, because we've never experienced anything like October the 7th.
I think what we're going through, it's extortion. That's the word. I don't think, if God forbid 3,000 terrorists came in from, let's say, Wales into Bristol and killed 1,200 people and raped and beheaded and took over 250 people back into Wales, and then started calling, when Israel protected itself. I can't see England going in, trying to retrieve the people, trying to make sure that the missiles, the non-stop missiles that were sent over to Israel, thousands a day, would stop to keep its citizens safe. I don't see any other nation that would be then called for committing genocide. Unfortunately, Hamas, Gaza, all the Palestinian people are held hostage by Hamas as well. So for years, millions of pounds went from the UN and from countries around the world to give aid to the Gazan people. And all of it was invested in terror, in creating missiles and tunnels, like the terror tunnels. It's bigger than the London Underground, the amount of infrastructure and time they've put into it. And I think the Gazan people, even before, they had only certain times a day they were allowed to use electricity, and certain amount of a time of day they were supposed to use water, because they were under horrific conditions even before 7th of October, because Hamas was ruling them and they need to be freed from Hamas. But because of those conditions, if you want to have an income, Hamas will only give Gazans, an income if they harm Israelis. So they are harboring terrorists there. So if we have millions of people there, and if you want to have your family, make sure they have shelter and food, I'm sure there's hundreds of thousands of terrorists ready to go, because they don't have any other choice to feed their family. And with that, I'm thinking, what, if we need to let go of 10,000 terrorists or 1,000 terrorists or 20,000 terrorists, we have hundreds of thousands across the border waiting to go. Just Israel needs to enforce its borders and to be strong and to have a very good protective mechanism. And the stump terrorists we're going to give up to get our people back, it shouldn't be a consideration.
One final question I have is, what next? Where does the UK Family Hostage Forum go from here?
Right now, I know for the next 3 weeks, we're dealing with the heartache of the community and the anticipation to seeing the hostages coming out. And we're bringing communities, if it's really uniting, if it's people from the Orthodox community and Reform and Masorti and Liberal and Spanish, and everyone's coming together. We're creating vigils after each release to come together and either, be very thankful for the people that came, or have a space to cry together for the people that are not coming back alive. And after that, I will need to keep pressing on Parliament to make sure that they make sure that the deal doesn't stop and all of the hostages come out. There's 90 hostages that need to come out. There's 90 families that are waiting for their loved ones to come back, and we can't stop until all of them are back home.
Nivi, kol hakavod for the incredible work that you are doing to help bring the hostages home, and our thoughts and our prayers are with the hostages. They have been ever since October the 7th. Our thoughts and prayers are with the families of the hostages and the nation of Israel. I just want to reassure you that you're not alone, and in this struggle that we're with you. And just please pass that message on to the families of the hostages, that we love them, we care about them, we are praying for them, and we're raising awareness about their plight. And we won't keep silent either until all of them come home.
Thank you so much. It's very comforting to hear. Thank you, guys. Thank you for having me.
Well, and it is on the hearts and minds of many exactly what Nivi was just sharing with us, is it not, that even after this phase, 33 hostages, most alive, thankfully, but a number of them dead, there's still many more hostages that remain. And a massive concern for Israelis around the world, and for the Israeli government, is what next? What's going to occur in coming days?
You and I know, we've known ever since October the 7th, that the #1 priority of the Israeli people is to bring them home, to see the hostages come home. And that overrides the kind of military objectives in Gaza. And that's why we got to continue to pray for people like Nivi, continue to pray for the families of the hostages and the hostages themselves, those 90 who are still remaining. And as of this program, we don't know how many are alive or dead, but we know that, for example, the Daily Telegraph has produced an excellent article entitled, "With the release of each hostage, fear only grows for those left behind." It says Israel celebrates freedom for women soldiers. The fate of 90 captives remains uncertain. As thousands of Israelis come to cheer the helicopter bringing back 4 Israeli hostages from Gaza on Saturday, it was a bittersweet moment as the nation also mourned those who were left behind. The hostages, Liri, Albag, 19, Naama, Levy, 20, Karina Ariev, 20, Daniella Gilboa, 20. All soldiers in the Israeli Defense Force were dressed in what appeared to be military uniforms before the return of their freedom.
X.com has been a source of a lot of information from the ground, and there are quite widespread rumors that there may be as many as 6 to 8 of these hostages who are dead. And of course, a massive concern is definitely, of course, the fate of those, as Nivi was just sharing, the young children, and reportedly dead back in November of 2023, but never confirmed as such. So perhaps we'll be seeing in coming days. But what we can be glad for these who have been released, soldier or civilian, everyone in Israel is valued. Their lives are valued. They are held equally, and so I understand the distinction, but I think it's important that we recognize and have joy in the release of these ones who essentially, they were just doing their duty as conscripts into the IDF, and were mercifully kept alive, though many of their comrades were slaughtered in horrifying ways. In a display that hasn't been seen in previous hostage releases, the young women had been paraded on stage by their captors and forced to wave and smile before signing release papers. The Red Cross is involved in all of this as well. At Palestine Hospital near Tel Aviv, the 4 who were kidnapped from the Nahal Oz military base on the Gaza border on October 7th, 2023, wearing only their pajamas, would be reunited with their families for the first time in 477 days. The Telegraph spoke to Ada Levinsky, who grew up in the same kibbutz as the oldest hostage still held in Gaza, Shlomo Mansour, who will be 87 in March. She said she feared for the life of her old friend, who was kidnapped from kibbutz Kasufim. Nobody has seen him or heard from him, she said from Hostage Square in Tel Aviv, where hundreds gathered to watch the handover of the hostages to the Red Cross in Gaza, live streamed on giant screens. Born in Iraq, Mr. Mansour speaks Arabic. It's the only hope we have that it might help him, Ms. Levinsky added, though there have been no signs of life since his abduction. He's very small and thin. We're very worried about his health, she added.
And Telegraph continues to report that while the crowds shed tears of joy for the release of the 4 young women, she admitted, it's impossible to be happy even today. With around 90 hostages still held in Gaza, so many families still await news of their loved ones. Ron Hudi, who is the former mayor of Tel Aviv, told the Telegraph it was a bittersweet day. He says, I have conflicted emotions today. There is joy of seeing the girls free, but still there's a lot of work to do. We still feel so much pain, he said.
Gilly Roman's sister Yarden was part of the first wave of releases in November 2023. He was also at Hostage Square. I'm very excited and relieved to see this and super proud of our women who show so much strength in front of these vicious men who try to show them as exhibits, he told the Telegraph. For those families still waiting, they are extremely nervous, but at the same time they can be hopeful as they saw that it's still possible that they can be saved. At the hospital, thousands turned out to see the arrival of the helicopter, waving Israeli flags and cheering Am Yisrael Chai, long live the people of Israel, or actually that's the Telegraph's mistranslation of it. It simply means the people of Israel live.
Exactly. And it's also important to have a look at what will be the long-term psychological impact and emotional impact of these Israeli hostages that now find themselves released. So Daily Telegraph also report that Dr. Eitan Witherim, the Director General of the hospital, said that she expects the 4 young women to be quite well despite their horrific ordeal. Says it's more important than the physical will be the mental, he told the Telegraph. It's a very huge change being a hostage with no control of your life to now having total control of it. He goes on to say that some have a difficulty going into large crowds or hearing large noises, so there are many who have implications. He went on to say it's not just about being in prison, it's about being kidnapped, tortured, at least mentally. It's the worst situation for anyone, not knowing if they'll stay alive. And we also see that this month Ronen Bar, who heads up Israel's Shin Bet security agency, said that more than 1,000 terrorists released in 2021 in exchange for the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit by Hamas in Gaza, that 82% of those who were released went on to commit acts of terrorism against Israel.
We have a statement from the Prime Minister's office. The Prime Minister's office, translated from the Hebrew, sees on Monday, the 27th of January, Benjamin Netanyahu say, following the conducting of vigorous and determined negotiations led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Hamas has backtracked and will carry out an additional phase of releasing hostages this Thursday. In this phase, the civilian Arbel Yehud, the soldier Agam Berger, and an additional hostage will be released. In accordance with the agreement, 3 additional hostages will be released this Saturday. In parallel, Israel has received from Hamas a list that includes the status of all of the hostages due to be released in the first stage. Under these agreements, Israel will, from tomorrow morning, allow the passage of Gazans to the northern strip. The Prime Minister reiterates that Israel will not tolerate any violation of the agreement. We will continue to act for the return of all our hostages, the living and the deceased.
Of course, we know that Hamas went against the proposed deal because they weren't supposed to release those 3 young Israeli soldiers, but instead were supposed to release civilians as well, as we heard so elegantly from Levy in our interview there. So we see, for example, that even when it comes to releasing the hostages, that Hamas is not playing ball, and as a response to this, the Israeli government then stopped the residents of Gaza in the south moving back to their homes in the north of Gaza as a direct consequence.
I have a theory, Simon, and I think this is the theory that's being expressed across Israel, that Levy alluded to, that there is grave concern for the status, particularly of the civilians who are left, particularly while there has been proof of life, it's not so much in what's said, it's in what's not being said. There's proof of life for Albag, the civilian. Nothing has been said regarding proof of life in relation to the Bibas family. And so our prayer is definitely that against all odds they will have survived. But I think Hamas is very well aware of the potential of absolute, justified, unbridled rage should the Bibas family be dead. And this has been a family that has captured the hearts of the nation, that has been at the forefront really of campaigns to bring the hostages home. And people around the world, should they not be alive, are going to, you know, let's just say I think there will be ramifications for Hamas going forward, and they realize that this puts them in a worse light. So they're getting their act together to figure out how they're going to present the deaths of those who have perished. Israel also knows. Israel, the government now does know who is alive and who is dead. So we'll see how they respond as well.
And it's only going to be a question of time before that is actually then made public. But of course, the Israeli government have the duty to inform the families of the hostages about those who have died in captivity by Hamas, or maybe even died on October the 7th. To be fair, the sheer terror that those Israelis faced back on October the 7th is amazing how any of them kind of really survived what they went through, but then to be taken to back to Gaza, held in the most horrific conditions,
477
and denied the Red Cross as well. I mean,
Yes.
this is what's so horrific, being transferred from one terror tunnel to another, whilst probably the Israelis were above ground trying to find out where they are. And of course, this makes it very difficult in terms of military operation when you've got a number of different objectives. Your objectives: find the hostages, bring them home, destroy Hamas and destroy their terrorist infrastructure, including their terror tunnels. Sometimes those military objectives can be odd. So, of course, it's very difficult for the families. But this is something that I think Israel needs to learn the lessons from really after October the 7th, and to ensure that nothing ever happens like that again. But it also does show you how much the Israelis value human life, and the kind of motto of the IDF is never ever leave anyone behind. And of course, the terrorists like Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, they know all this because they're a death cult. They celebrate death rather than life, while Israelis celebrate life and the gift of life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The Times of Israel has reported on Monday, 27th of January, under the following headline: Israel, Albag, Agam Berger, and a third hostage to be freed on Thursday, with 3 more on Saturday. The Prime Minister's office also says that Hamas has sent how many first phase captives are alive, with the tally matching Israeli intelligence. IDF is set to allow Gazans to return to strips north on Monday morning, with Israel announcing Sunday night that a dispute over the implementation of the ceasefire and hostage deal with Hamas in Gaza had been resolved. The terror group set to release 6 hostages in 2 batches this week, including civilian woman Albag and soldier Agam Berger. Jerusalem also said Hamas had finally sent a list detailing the conditions of the remaining hostages set to be released in the ongoing 42-day first phase of the ceasefire beginning on January the 19th. Both the failure to send this list by Saturday and Hamas's failure to free Yehud before IDF servicewomen had been regarded by Israel as violations of the truce deal. With matters resolved, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office has said that the military would allow hundreds of thousands of displaced Gazans to return to the strips north through the Netzarim corridors starting on Monday morning. With NBC News previously reporting that Keith Siegel, 65, a U.S. native, would be released in the coming week, though there was no confirmation and it was unclear if this would happen on Thursday or Saturday.
And the Times of Israel go on to actually report that in exchange for the hostages, Israel will release 3 Palestinian security prisoners, 30 for each civilian and 50 for Berger, including 30 terrorists serving life sentences. And you only get a life sentence in Israel if you actually commit murder. So it just shows you what the lengths that Israel is prepared to do in order to bring the hostages home. It says the fate of Yehud had become a major sticking point in the deal's implementation, with Israel blocking the return of Palestinians to northern Gaza after Hamas released 4 female soldiers on Saturday. Under the ceasefire and hostage release deal, the terror group had been required to prioritise the release of civilian women. And Yehud is being held by Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and they are sponsored by the Iranian regime, which had reportedly been falsely describing her as a soldier and demanding more prisoners to be released in return of her. So Khan, the public Israeli broadcaster, reported on Sunday evening that Palestinian Islamic Jihad had agreed to classify as a civilian, helping to resolve the crisis. And this is the kind of complexities that the Israeli negotiating team, the American negotiating team, having to deal with. The fact is they're not dealing with one single terrorist entity. They're dealing with Hamas, yes, but they're also, and they are backed up by the Muslim Brotherhood and the Qataris, and then of course we have Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who are directly sponsored by the Iranian regime. And I fundamentally believe if it wasn't for Israel's destruction of Hezbollah and the collapse of President Assad's regime in Syria, for example, that we wouldn't be progressing as far as we got in terms of bringing the hostages home. And Palestinian Islamic Jihad directly answer to their paymasters in Tehran and no one else. So the fact is that Hamas have been able to put pressure on them to release Fahud, the other Israeli hostage, is quite remarkable in itself.
Reports have previously stated that Israel believes 25 of the total of 33 hostages slated for release in the first phase are alive. 7 captives already released alive over the past couple of weeks. This would mean that 18 of the remaining 26 hostages are alive, while 8 are dead. Arbel Yehud, 28, and her boyfriend Ariel Cuneo, 26, were kidnapped from kibbutz near Oz on October the 7th of 2023 when thousands of Hamas-led terrorists stormed southern Israel to kill some 1,200 people and take 251 hostages, sparking this horrible war in Gaza.
Absolutely. And the Israeli security expert, IDF Brigadier General, who's now reserved, Yossi Kupavasa, has written a very interesting article in the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs under this heading: Hamas reaps the fruits of its deadly attack. Israel seeks gains in other areas. So it says the agreement to begin the release of the hostages in exchange for a 42-day ceasefire was intended to transition into a permanent one, includes significant concessions. These involve the release of a large number of Palestinian prisoners held in Israel, including a number of those convicted murderers, in return to the return of Palestinian populations to northern Gaza, the influx of humanitarian aid, the reduction of IDF's presence in Gaza, potentially leading to the withdrawal from the Philadelphia corridor, and Hamas retaining control over Gaza. The agreement leaves Israel with mixed emotions. Joy at the anticipated return of the hostages is tempered by frustration at the high cost. And of course, I don't think any of us can comprehend the huge cost that Israel and Israelis are having to pay in order for these hostages to come home. And the fact is that Benjamin Netanyahu drew 3 red lines in terms of his war against Hamas in Gaza. Number 1, that Hamas would be eliminated. Number 2, that Hamas could never return to power in Gaza, and certainly wouldn't be able to carry out another October the 7th in a decade time, and to bring the hostages home. And I think it's really that Trump's being on the scene and his administration has forced Israel into the negotiating position to pay a high price in order to get those hostages home. And of course, we have to understand this is also part of honor culture within the Middle East, within Arab culture, that Hamas, for example, want to show that they have a victory. And I think we can see this very, very well in an excellent news report put together by our friends at CBN.
Only in the Middle East do they claim victory even after suffering heavy losses. The recent Gaza ceasefire has led many Palestinians, as well as other Arabs throughout the Islamic world, to assert that they've defeated the Zionists and emerged victorious over the Israelis. But are these claims valid? Let's examine the facts. 6 top Hamas leaders, including Yahya Sinwar and Ismail Haniyeh, along with thousands of their fighters, have been killed. And what about the landscape of Gaza? Does it appear victorious to you? So what does the future hold? President Trump has expressed skepticism about the continuation of the ceasefire beyond the initial phase.
That's not our war, it's their war, but I'm not confident, but I think they're very weakened on the other side.
Do you support the two-state
Gaza, boy, I looked at a picture of Gaza. Gaza is like a massive demolition site. That place it's really got to be rebuilt in a different way.
Do you plan to help rebuilding Gaza?
I might. You know, Gaza is interesting. It's a phenomenal location. On the sea, the best weather. You know, everything's good. It's like some beautiful things could be done with it, but it's very interesting. But some fantastic things could be done with Gaza.
How do you see the future in governance for Gaza?
Well, it depends. I can't imagine you could have, well, you certainly can't have the people that were there. Most of them are dead, by the way, right? Most of them are dead. But they didn't exactly run it well. Run viciously and badly. So you can't have that.
The future of Gaza truly lies in the hands of the Palestinians, not the Israelis. Will they choose to liberate themselves from the oppression, hardship, and destruction that Hamas has inflicted upon them? They can embrace peaceful coexistence and invest billions to advance their society instead of spending it on rockets, guns, and missiles. They have the opportunity to provide their children with a prosperous future, a quality of life similar to that enjoyed by Arabs in the UAE and Bahrain. Alternatively, they can choose a future filled with further devastation, violence, misery, chaos, and oppression. Which would you choose? Let us pray for lasting peace in Gaza and Jerusalem, that light will overcome darkness, and that love will conquer hate.
Solid words there from our friend Gary Line at CBN there, and indeed this is bringing us to the culmination of our program, really, and asking what is the future for Gaza? Will it choose love over hate? I'm not convinced.
Well, I think the answer there is, again, the whole process of de-Hamasification. The Allies had a program called denazification, where they denazified Germany. I don't think they did a good job in Austria, of essentially removing any members of the Nazi regime from a future democratic West Germany. And also that means that those who were indoctrinated within the Nazi youth would be indoctrinated within that ideology. But it wasn't until, for example, the German people felt the misery of Nazi ideology when their homes were destroyed, when their loved ones were destroyed, and they saw for themselves the total devastation and destruction that Hitler and his Nazi ideology had brought on the regime in Germany. Did they then believe that this was wrong? and they wanted to follow in the paths of democracy, certainly West Germany, because East Germany was held by the Soviets. So I think in the same way, it's not until Hamas and the people of Gaza really feel the effects of what Hamas has brought misery and ruin upon Gaza. It's easy to blame Israel for this, but Israel would not have gone into Gaza had it not been for the biggest mass terrorist attack in its history by Hamas back on October the 7th. So Trump has come up with this very interesting idea to move 1 million residents of Gaza and giving them homes in Egypt and in Jordan.
You're talking about 1.5 million people, he said, and we just clean out that whole thing. He told DailyMail.com, and as usual, colloquial way. He was speaking to them aboard the presidential jet Air Force One on Saturday. Maybe you should see if you can wrangle a Air Force One interview with.
Sounds like a good idea. So if you have some connections, I'll definitely be open to that.
It was unclear if he meant move everyone out, but the idea will be immediately controversial, has been immediately controversial, stoking Arab fears of a plot to give Palestinian land to Israel. But ever the property mogul as well, Trump saw the solution to the region's conflict in construction and land, as he described a phone call with Jordan's King Abdullah earlier in the day. And so it's going to be interesting to see if this actually is what happens.
But it was interesting what he said from a kind of property developer. The fact is that Gaza has a beautiful weather, has beautiful beaches. Instead of building bombs and terror tunnels, why don't they build hotels? Why don't they build restaurants? Why don't they build business centres and schools and roads and improve the infrastructure of Hamas so that it can be like a Dubai in the Middle East?
Let's clear out so that we can actually completely get rid of the terror tunnels, right? Because tragically, there's only a fraction of those that have actually been destroyed. And intelligence is showing that some have even been expanded. So despite amazing efforts to do it, it's such a vast network. You know, the more we look at it, the more difficult it looks for Benjamin Netanyahu going forward to claim a solid victory here, because there's multiple objectives that have been missed.
Thank you so much for watching tonight's Behind the Headlines. Let's continue to keep the remaining hostages in our prayers, as well as those who have come back to their families and loved ones, and the amount of care that's needed to look after them now will be immense, and so our prayers are needed. But we also need to speak up and remind everyone of the horrors of Hamas, and let's see how Hamas betrayed their own people. Thank you for watching this week's edition of Behind the Headlines.
Hamas stole the future of Gaza. In the last 2 decades, Hamas stole from the people of Gaza by transferring billions of dollars to Hamas leaders. Forbes magazine ranked Hamas as #2 in the world's richest terrorist organizations. The entire leadership of Hamas and their families fled Gaza for a life of luxury in Turkey and Qatar. With the billions that Hamas stole from Gaza, they could turn Gaza into paradise, invest in health, education, and infrastructure. Hamas stole the money from Gaza. Hamas stole the future of Gaza.